Pull that tray of discount ground turkey out of your shopping cart for a moment and really look at it. Not the cheerful label, not the leaf green packaging that whispers wholesome, but the actual meat pressed up against the plastic film. Notice the pinkish gray hue, the slight watery sheen pooling at the edges, the way the grind looks almost paste-like in places. That appearance isn't an accident. That appearance is the fingerprint of an industrial process most shoppers have no idea they're participating in. And tonight, I want to walk you through it. Because what ends up in that 1-pound tube of Bargain Bird is, in many cases, something entirely different from what your grandmother would have called ground turkey. Over the next several minutes, I'm going to show you what the discount turkey supply chain really looks like, what the USDA actually allows, what independent researchers have found when they tested these products, and how to protect your family from the specific risks tied to the cheapest tubes on the shelf. If anyone in your home is a child, pregnant, immunocompromised, or over 65, you need to hear this through to the end. Let's start with what the regulators themselves say, because I don't want you thinking this is hype. The USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service has repeatedly flagged ground poultry as one of the highest risk categories of meat sold in American supermarkets. A multi-year assessment published by the agency identified ground turkey specifically as a recurring vector for salmonella contamination, with positive sample rates that routinely exceeded other ground meats. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has tracked multiple multi-state outbreaks linked to ground turkey over the past decade, some of them involving strains that studies suggest are resistant to several classes of antibiotics commonly used in human medicine. Meanwhile, Consumer Reports Testing, one of the most cited independent investigations into ground poultry, found that the vast majority of samples pulled off retail shelves contained bacteria of concern, and a significant portion carried organisms that research indicates may not respond to first-line antibiotic treatments. The World Health Organization has gone further, classifying antibiotic resistance linked to agricultural overuse as one of the top 10 global public health threats of our generation. When you line those institutional voices up next to the cheerful marketing on a discount turkey tube, the gap between the image and the evidence becomes hard to ignore. Now let me explain how that discount price actually gets hit, because the economics tell the real story. A conventional turkey raised to full maturity on a mid-size farm, processed individually, and sold as bone-in cuts carries a certain irreducible cost. Feed, water, labor, veterinary care, slaughter, inspection, refrigeration, transport. When a processor commits to selling ground turkey at the lowest price point on the shelf, they cannot compress those costs arbitrarily. Something has to give. And what gives, in many cases, is the composition of the grind itself. Discount ground turkey in the United States is very often produced using a technology called mechanically separated poultry, or MSP, which involves forcing carcass remnants, the parts left after the breast, thigh, and wing meat have been removed for higher margin cuts, through a high-pressure sieve that separates soft tissue from bone. What emerges is a pinkish paste with a texture closer to cake frosting than to meat. USDA regulations permit this material to be labeled as poultry under certain conditions, and it frequently ends up in the cheapest ground products, in hot dogs, in nuggets, and in processed patties. If you've ever wondered why the grind in a $2 tube looks smoother and wetter than the grind from your local butcher, mechanical separation is a likely reason. But the composition concern is only the first layer. The second layer is what lives on and in that meat by the time it reaches your refrigerator. Turkey is a social bird, and industrial turkey operations often house tens of thousands of birds in a single enclosed barn. Studies published in peer-reviewed food science journals have documented that under those densities, pathogens like Salmonella, Campylobacter, Clostridium perfringens, and certain strains of E. coli can spread through a flock with remarkable efficiency. When the birds are processed, the contents of their digestive tracts can contaminate the carcass surface, and when the carcasses are then ground, especially when multiple birds are combined into a single batch, as is standard practice, the bacteria become distributed throughout the entire product rather than sitting on a surface that could be seared. One contaminated bird can seed thousands of pounds of ground turkey. That's not speculation. That's how batch processing works. And it's one of the reasons ground poultry has such a persistent recall history. Pull up the USDA Recall Archive, and you will find ground turkey recalls appearing, with a frequency that should make any thoughtful shopper pause. Then there is the chemistry that happens after grinding. To extend shelf life and keep the meat looking appetizing under fluorescent lighting, many discount ground turkey producers apply a rinse or injection containing ingredients that rarely make it onto the front of the package. You'll sometimes see phrases like, contains up to 15% of a solution in the fine print on the back of the tube, and that solution may include salt, sodium phosphates, natural flavors, carrageenan, or other additives intended to bind water into the protein matrix. The practical consequence is that a portion of what you weigh at the register and pay for by the pound is not meat at all, but water held in place by functional ingredients. Research published in journals focused on meat science has explored how phosphate additives affect moisture retention and texture. And while they are considered safe at regulated levels, the American Heart Association has repeatedly noted that cumulative sodium and phosphate intake from processed foods may contribute to cardiovascular and kidney concerns, particularly in people already managing blood pressure or renal function. Let's talk about the antibiotic question, because this is where the discount tier diverges most sharply from the premium tier. Conventional turkey production in the United States has historically relied on antibiotics at sub-therapeutic doses, both to prevent disease in crowded conditions and, in some cases, to encourage faster growth. The FDA issued guidance years ago intended to curtail growth promotion uses, but surveillance data compiled by the agency itself shows that antibiotic sales for food-producing animals remain enormous in absolute terms. The concern, as articulated by the World Health Organization and echoed by the American Medical Association, is that repeated low-dose exposure across huge animal populations creates selective pressure that favors resistant bacteria. Those resistant bacteria can then reach human consumers through contaminated meat, through farm runoff, through worker contact. Studies examining retail ground turkey have isolated strains of Salmonella and E. coli that laboratory analysis suggests are resistant to multiple antibiotic classes. That doesn't mean every tube of discount ground turkey is dangerous. It does mean the discount category, which correlates with the most conventional production practices, is the category where the resistance concern clusters most tightly. I want to walk you through what a real-world contamination event looks like, because abstract numbers don't stick the way a story does. Imagine a family of four, a Tuesday night, a skillet of discount ground turkey browned into a taco filling. The cook, distracted by homework questions and a ringing phone, doesn't quite get the center of the grind to 165 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature the USDA specifies for poultry, the temperature at which the dangerous bacteria are reliably inactivated. The meat looks done, it smells fine, it tastes fine. 12 to 72 hours later, one family member starts running a fever, then another. Abdominal cramping, watery diarrhea, vomiting. The young child is hit hardest because her body mass is smallest and her immune system is still developing. Emergency room, IV fluids. A stool culture that comes back positive for a Salmonella serotype. This sequence plays out thousands of times a year in the United States, and the CDC's outbreak investigations consistently tie a meaningful share of those cases back to poultry, ground turkey in particular. The tragedy is that many of those illnesses were preventable with either a hotter pan, a cleaner cutting board, or a different tube of meat. There's also a labeling issue that deserves your attention. Phrases that sound reassuring on discount ground turkey packaging often carry much narrower legal meanings than consumers assume. Natural, on a USDA-regulated meat product, simply means minimally processed with no artificial ingredients or added colors. It says nothing about how the bird was raised, what it was fed, or whether antibiotics were used. Fresh on poultry means the product has never been held below a specific temperature, not that it was processed recently. Raised without antibiotics is a meaningful claim when verified by a third-party certifier, but unverified versions of similar-sounding language appear on packages with varying degrees of oversight. And vegetarian fed tells you something about the feed, but nothing about confinement, stocking density, or pathogen load. The fine print matters, and on the cheapest tubes, the fine print often reveals that the reassuring front-of-package language is doing more marketing work than informational work. Let me also address the frozen reformed category, because a lot of what shoppers think of as ground turkey is actually a hybrid product. Frozen turkey patties, frozen meatballs, and frozen meatloaf mixes can contain ground turkey, along with textured vegetable protein, soy isolate, breadcrumb fillers, caramel color, and a constellation of stabilizers designed to keep the product intact through freezing and microwaving. Nutrition scientists have written extensively about how ultra-processed meat products differ metabolically from whole muscle meat, and a growing body of epidemiological research suggests that higher intake of ultra-processed foods may contribute to elevated risk of metabolic and cardiovascular conditions over time. A frozen turkey meatball that lists 20-plus ingredients is not the lean protein food its packaging implies. It's a processed meat product wearing the aesthetics of one. Let me dig into the cold chain problem, because what happens between the processing plant and your refrigerator has an outsized effect on what lives inside that package. Discount ground turkey often travels through the longest, most fractured supply chain in the poultry market. A processor in one state sells to a distributor in another, who sells to a regional warehouse, who sells to a grocery chain's own warehouse, which then ships to individual stores. At each handoff, the meat sits in trucks, on loading docks, in coolers with doors opening every few minutes. Food safety engineers call this cumulative time temperature exposure, and research in meat science journals suggests that even brief periods above 40 degrees Fahrenheit can meaningfully expand the bacterial load on a product. Premium ground meats tend to move through shorter, tighter cold chains, sometimes processed and packed by the same operation that raised the birds. Discount ground meats are engineered to survive a longer logistical journey, and they arrive at your store having experienced more thermal stress than the packaging will ever tell you. When you pick up a tube and notice that the meat feels slightly warmer than the surrounding packages, or that the package has a small puddle of pink liquid pooled inside. You're looking at a signal of that cumulative stress. There is also the grinder sharing issue that independent food safety investigators have documented. A single industrial grinder processes enormous volumes of turkey every hour, and between batches, the equipment is cleaned according to regulatory standards. But cross-contamination between batches is an inherent feature of high-volume processing. If a single contaminated bird enters the grinder early in a shift, trace amounts of the contamination can persist through cleaning cycles and appear in subsequent batches. This is why USDA recalls of ground turkey often involves specific production dates and plant codes. Regulators trace contamination events back to specific shifts at specific facilities. If you look up the establishment number printed on the back of your ground turkey package and search the USDA recall database against it, you can sometimes learn things about the production history of that exact plant that the front of the package would prefer you not know. I want to pause and talk about seasoning and solution patterns you might not have noticed. Some discount ground turkey is sold as plain ground turkey, but a growing share is marketed as seasoned ground turkey, taco-ready ground turkey, or burger-seasoned ground turkey. These seasoned products carry ingredient panels that can extend to 15 or 20 items, including autolyzed yeast extract, hydrolyzed soy protein, maltodextrin, natural flavors, disodium inosinate, disodium guanylate, modified food starch, and various spice extracts. Most of these additives are considered safe by the FDA, but cumulatively they represent a processing layer you may not have signed up for. The pre-seasoned tubes often cost only a few cents more than the plain tubes, which is why many busy families grab them. But the convenience comes with an ingredient stack worth acknowledging. If you want seasoned turkey, buying plain turkey and adding your own seasoning from a spice cabinet is nearly as fast and gives you full control of what ends up on your stove. Consider the moisture and texture manipulation that happens before the tube is sealed. Industrial grinders often use carbon dioxide injection or other modified atmosphere packaging techniques to extend shelf life and maintain color. The packages you see on the shelf are typically filled with a gas blend that may include carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and in some cases, small amounts of carbon monoxide, depending on the processor. Carbon monoxide modified atmosphere packaging has been the subject of particular scrutiny because low levels of the gas bind to the myoglobin in meat and keep it looking bright pink long after it would otherwise start to show the color signs of aging. The FDA has reviewed carbon monoxide packaging and permits it within specified limits, but consumer advocacy groups have argued that it can make spoilage harder to detect visually. When a tube of ground turkey stays pink on day 8 after opening but smells wrong, the color may be telling you less than your nose. The issue of plant closures and regulatory attention is worth knowing about. Over the past several years, USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service has issued enforcement actions against several major poultry processors, citing issues that ranged from sanitary violations to record-keeping failures to positive pathogen tests. Some of these actions have resulted in temporary plant shutdowns, product recalls, and public notifications. The media coverage of these events tends to be modest, and most consumers don't track the regulatory news cycle closely, but the record is public. If you care about where your meat comes from, the establishment number on your package is a doorway to that record, and a few minutes of research can tell you whether the plant that produced your tube has a clean history or a recurring pattern of concerns. Let's talk briefly about the relationship between discount ground turkey and the prepared foods industry. A meaningful share of discount ground turkey sold in American grocery stores does not go home with consumers as tubes of plain meat. It is bought in bulk by food service operations, by prepared meal companies, and by frozen food manufacturers who use it as the protein base in meatballs, chili, taco kits, stuffed peppers, and a long list of other convenience products. Which means that even if you never buy a tube of discount ground turkey yourself, if you buy frozen prepared foods containing turkey, you're likely consuming meat that came from the same supply chain. The labeling on prepared foods does not typically disclose the grade or source of the turkey inside, and the industry's reliance on the cheapest available protein means the turkey in a frozen chili or a frozen meatloaf is often the most industrial version of the product. So what do you actually do with all of this? Here is how I'd advise you to navigate the turkey aisle going forward. First, read the ingredient line, not the front panel. Real ground turkey should list exactly one thing: turkey. If you see a solution, a phosphate, a flavoring, a carrageenan, a dextrose, or a list of items that reads like a chemistry assignment, put it back. The cleanest products have the shortest ingredient lines. Second, favor ground turkey that specifies the cut, ground turkey breast, for instance, or ground turkey thigh, because cut-specific grinds are less likely to contain mechanically separated material. Generic ground turkey with no cut indication is the category where MSP most often lives. Third, look for third-party verifications rather than self-made marketing claims. Certifications like Certified Humane, Global Animal Partnership, Animal Welfare Approved, and USDA Organic carry audit requirements that go beyond what a brand can claim on its own. Fourth, consider grinding your own at home using a simple countertop grinder attachment or a food processor with a turkey breast you trust. It takes 4 minutes, it gives you full transparency, and it often costs less per pound than the premium pre-ground tubes. Fifth, if you do buy pre-ground, handle it like the high-risk food it is: a dedicated cutting board, a meat thermometer in the thickest part of the cooked product, a sanitizing wipe-down of every surface the raw meat touched, and hand-washing with soap for at least 20 seconds. Sixth, freeze immediately if you won't cook within 48 hours and thaw in the refrigerator rather than on the counter, because the surface bacteria multiply rapidly in the temperature range between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, what food scientists call the danger zone. Seventh, trust your senses. A sour smell, a slimy feel, a gray-green tint in places that should be pink. These are not quirks, they are warnings. And no amount of hot pan cooking guarantees safety once spoilage toxins have formed. Before you close this out and go back to your evening, I want to leave you with one honest thought. Discount ground turkey isn't poison. Millions of tubes of it are eaten safely every week by families managing real grocery budgets, and I'm not here to tell you that a single package will harm anyone. What I am telling you is that the discount tier sits at the intersection of several risk factors: industrial scale, mechanical separation, batch mixing, antibiotic exposure, solution injection, and thin labeling. And those factors compound in ways the cheerful front panel doesn't advertise. You deserve to know what you're buying. You deserve to know what questions to ask. And you deserve to know that spending a few more dollars on a cleaner product, or grinding your own, or buying from a local processor is not a luxury reserved for wealthy shoppers. It's a choice any thoughtful cook can make with the information you now have. Protect the people at your table, read the labels, cook to temperature, and share this with the parents, the grandparents, and the young adults in your life who buy groceries on autopilot. Because the autopilot is exactly where the food industry wants them to stay.